All right, today we're tackling a number you've heard a million times, GDP. It's the number, right? The one that tells us how well a country's doing. But what if it's only telling us a tiny part of the story?
I mean, really think about it. When someone says the US has the biggest economy, what are they even talking about? How do you possibly measure something so ridiculously huge and complicated? And more importantly, what gets lost when we try to squish all of that complexity into just one number?
Well, for a long, long time, the answer has been that one number, gross domestic product. GDP. It's the headline that moves markets, the number politicians live and die by. But is it really the be-all and end-all for a country's success? I'm not so sure. Yeah, what if our obsession with this one little acronym is actually hiding the real story? What if a country's GDP is going up, but life isn't actually getting better for most people? Let's dig in. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is this number that has such a grip on our world? We're going to break down what GDP is, and maybe even more importantly, what it isn't. Okay, here's the textbook definition. Gross just means the total amount. Domestic means it's happening inside a country's borders. And product is, well, it's all the stuff, the goods and services that get produced. But honestly, the two words you really need to remember here are final and within. They're the key. Let me explain why. Let's make this super simple. Imagine a whole country is just one giant bakery. The GDP is the total price of all the finished cakes and bread it sells. That's it. We don't count the bags of flour or the sugar used to make the cakes because the cost of that flour is already baked into the price of the final cake, right? It's all about avoiding double counting. That's why we only look at final goods. So how on earth do economists calculate a number that massive? Well, believe it or not, it comes down to a pretty straightforward formula. Now, I know, it looks like a bunch of letters from algebra class, but stick with me. This little formula is actually just adding up the four main places money gets spent in an economy. Let's break it down piece by piece. Okay, let's go through it. C is for consumption. That's basically you and me. It's the money we spend on groceries, coffee, movie tickets, all of it. I is for investment. Now, don't think stocks and bonds. This is about businesses buying new stuff, like a factory getting a new robot or a company building a new office. G is government spending. Think new roads, bridges, military spending, that kind of thing. And finally, that little X minus M thingy, that's just net exports. It's the value of stuff a country sells to other countries minus the value of stuff it buys from other countries. You add all that up, and boom, you've got GDP. All right, you've probably heard other acronyms thrown around that sound a lot like GDP, especially GNP. They're like close cousins, and knowing the difference is actually pretty important. So yeah, the other big one is gross national product, or GNP. And the difference is actually really simple when you get down to it. GDP is all about location. It counts everything produced inside a country's borders, no matter who makes it. GNP, on the other hand, is all about citizenship. It counts everything produced by a country's citizens, no matter where in the world they are. And check this out. This is where it gets kind of cool. If you look at the US in 2023, its GNP was actually a bit higher than its GDP. So what does that tell you? It means American people and companies were earning more money out there in the world than foreign companies were earning inside the US. But for the UK, it was the other way around. It seems like a small detail, but it paints a totally different picture of a country's global economic reach. Okay, one last technical bit, but it's a super important one. The difference between nominal and real GDP. Let's go back to our bakery. Say in year one, it makes 10 loaves of bread and sells them for $3 each. That's $30 added to GDP. Simple. But what if the next year, because of inflation, the price of bread jumps to $4, but the bakery still only makes 10 loaves? The nominal GDP would be $40. Whoa, it looks like the economy grew by $10. But did it? No, we didn't actually produce anything more. That's why we have real GDP. It strips out the effects of inflation so we can see if we're actually making more stuff or if things are just getting more expensive. That's why economists almost always focus on real GDP. So, okay, we've got a handle on what GDP is. But honestly, the most important part of this whole thing isn't what GDP counts. It's what it doesn't count. This is where the story gets really, really interesting. And here's the kicker. GDP was never, ever designed to measure how happy or healthy a country is. The guy who invented it in the 1930s just needed a way to figure out how much the economy had shrunk during the Great Depression. That was its only job. Just think about everything that gets left out. All the unpaid work that actually makes society function, caring for kids, looking after elderly parents, that's worth zero to GDP. What about the cost of pollution? A factory can pump out smoke, and GDP just sees the value of the stuff it makes, not the damage it causes. And it says absolutely nothing about inequality, whether the wealth is spread out or if it's all going to a tiny few at the top. It has no way to measure stuff like trust or community or, the things that actually make life worth living.
Let me give you a perfect real-world example of this. You look at a country like Equatorial Guinea. On paper, its GDP per person is about $17,000. That's actually one of the highest in Africa. So you'd think, wow, things must be going great there.
But then you look a little closer, and you find out that around 70% of the people there live below the poverty line. How is that possible? Well, all that money comes from oil, and it's basically all going to a very small elite. And that right there is the fundamental flaw of GDP. It can tell you how big the economic pie is, but it tells you nothing about how the slices are being handed out.
Okay, so if GDP is so flawed, what's the answer? What's the alternative? How should we be measuring what actually matters?
Well, let's be fair. There's a reason we still use GDP. It's simple. Every country calculates it the same way, and we've been tracking it for decades. If you just want a quick and dirty snapshot of an economy's size, yeah, it's useful. But as we've just seen, it is a million miles from perfect.
The good news is there's a whole movement of people pushing to look beyond it. Groups like Carnegie UK are developing totally new ways to measure progress. Imagine if instead of just GDP, we had a gross domestic well-being index, something that tracked things like health, education, the quality of our environment, right alongside economic numbers. The idea is to get a much, much richer picture of how a country is really doing.
And really, that leaves us with the biggest question of all. For so long, our main goal as a society has just been more. More growth, more stuff. But what if we've been chasing the wrong number this whole time? What if the ultimate goal of a country shouldn't be just growing the economy, but improving the lives of its people? Now that's a conversation worth having.